Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Judge Ruth Kraft. I chair the Employment Law Group at Kirschenbaum and Kirschenbaum. I'm delighted to speak to all of you today. The genesis of this particular webinar is actually calls that I've received the last month from clients, many of whom are in the security industry. Just because you perform security functions on behalf of clients doesn't immunize you against the risk of defalcation or embezzlement in your own workplace. So I found that there was an important need for this particular subject matter. Today what we're going to discuss will be the following. I want to give you some examples of embezzlement. I think that they will shock you both in their scope, the amount of money involved, and the nefariousness of the schemes. To analyze why employee fraud occurs, because if you understand the basis for the fraud, you can mitigate or protect against it. The function of external audits, how to assess your risk, how much at risk are you for internal fraud, the nature of compliance programs, how to prevent embezzlement, the specific control measures you can consider, and finally, issues involving fraud online, on the internet. So, let me give you some choice examples. In 2013, the financial director for a major charity was sentenced to 7 years in prison for grand larceny and using a false instrument for filing. She was also required to make restitution and pay back taxes. She had embezzled over $250,000 in a 4-year period and used the money to pay for such things as clothing, her kids' tuition, and personal expenses. So how did she do it? She had a debit card, and she would go to the machine, the ATM, every week, and she would make withdrawals and make it look like they were petty cash, only they weren't so petty in the end, and they went straight into her own pocket. And because she was a signatory to the operating account, she was able to get that debit card. The defalcation wasn't discovered for 5 years, and then an external audit happened to be conducted and picked up the signal. Another great example, executive director wrote himself 213 authorized checks totaling $1.35 million. And how did he do it? He inflated the cost of legitimate expenses so that he put in invoices that were false and then used the difference to pay himself. He also embezzled, in addition to the $1.35 million, he also stole money, cash, every week out of the till. And that was only discovered after he left his job and a new person came in. Now this is my favorite one. The CFO of a company stole $348,000 over 3 years. And how did he do it? He kept people who he had fired on the payroll. So what he would do is he would show the tax amounts on his internal system as salary, would not issue a W-2, and then having shown this as an expense on the books, what did he do with the money? He transferred them, wire transferred them into his own personal bank account, I kid you not. And then he labeled the wire transfers as payments to the Internal Revenue Service. So that's really something. And one of the tragic ones involves the Ronald McDonald House. The treasurer of the Ronald McDonald House wrote checks and he wired funds from the charity to his personal accounts, and then he falsified reports to the board of directors. And the way that they found out about it was not at all through their own internal systems. What happened was he had done the same thing with a prior employer. And that prior employer conducted an audit, discovered it, knew where he was working, and contacted the subsequent employer and reported it. And I could go on for quite a bit of time about whether that's something you should be doing as an employer if you detect any fraud, but I just wanted to point that out. He had the pleasure of cooling his heels in a penitentiary in Minnesota for 3 years. So that's just to give you some ideas. Debit cards look like a bad thing in the scope of these kinds of cases. Another classic. Obviously, if someone writes checks to themselves for big numbers, it's going to send up a red flag. But what if you set up your own corporation as the embezzler, and then you list that company as a supplier of the corporation? So you have Alarm Equipment Supply Company, Inc., and the embezzler, the CFO, is writing checks. He produces invoices, only your company doesn't do business with this company. He's buying supplies elsewhere and doubling up, and all the money goes into his pocket. So the things that you need to consider as employers, and this is a seminar only for employers, and now you know why, are: do key employees have access to debit cards? If you give someone an access to a debit card, do you limit it? Who are the signatories to your operating account? Can a key employee write a check without having a co-signer? What systems do you have in place to distinguish between legitimate expenses and fraud? Are you able to track expenses so that if expenses go up 20% in a year, that it's going to create an internal red flag, and not just simply say, well, you know, we didn't have as good a year, we didn't make as much of a profit? Who handles your payroll? And the reason that's so important is, could the employee do what I just told you, keep terminated employees on the payroll and transfer their salaries to his own account? If you can figure out a way that somebody can do that, then you need to put a system in place to guard against it. Do you know if your employees have relationships with outside vendors? Do you commit the big Judge Ruth no-no and use signature stamps? I find them abhorrent. I think they are an invitation to fraud. And do you perform background checks on employees? So let me go back a little bit over this section, the Ask Yourself section. I was a law professor at New York University Law School for a long time, and one of the, I want to say, fun things I used to do with my classes is I would take a personal check and I would write, pay to the order of so-and-so, John Doe, and I would sign it literally Abraham Lincoln on a checkbook that said Ruth Kraft. And I'd send them to the bank and say, go to Chase or to Citi, which were near the school, try to cash this check for $2. It amazed me, it never ceased to amaze me, that the bank wouldn't even look at the signature to see that the name, which I basically printed out, I couldn't have made it more obvious, that the name matched the name on the checkbook. Bank would cash the check all the time. The funny thing was that if I gave them a check, and then I had 4 or 5 kids endorse the check, pay to the order of A, to the order of B, and they all kept endorsing on the back, which is a completely negotiable instrument under the Uniform Commercial Code. The bank would take one look at a double endorsement, never mind 5, and say, oh no, we couldn't possibly cash this. There could be some fraud. But, you know, when Abraham Lincoln signs Ruth Kraft's check, they had no problems with that whatsoever. So you must understand that part of the issues involved are the laxity with which these major financial institutions are willing to throw your money away. If you live in a small area and conduct business with a small community bank, and you can impress upon the bank officers the need to look critically at your account, you will be far better off than if you were dealing with one of these national banks that frankly could not care. Same thing about having a co-signer. If an entity tells the bank, we require 2 signatures on every check, see what happens if one person signs. I'll guarantee you that they will cash the check. So again, you're only as good as your bank in that regard. Payroll is a problem. If an employee who's fired keeps showing up on your payroll, but the person doing the payroll is the person who's the embezzler, well, then he's going to go through all sorts of machinations to make sure that there's no W-2 issued, so that the IRS doesn't raise a fuss, and so that that terminated employee doesn't say, why am I being charged for taxes on money I've never earned? So that's something to be very, very careful about. In terms of verifying whether employees have relationships with outside vendors, as some of you know, I'm the queen of employment policy manuals, and not the cheap kind, unfortunately. I write personalized documents for all of my clients, and there's a reason for that, because standard documents do not always work in the employment field. Everything in employment is very nuanced and very geared to the individual situation of how you operate your business. No two of you in your industry are going to be alike. You're going to have different priorities, different perspectives, different relationships with employees that you want to have evidenced with a writing. It is very important for you to have non-solicitation clauses in your employment manual. And the non-solicitation clause does not just mean that upon leaving your employment, they can't go and get a job elsewhere or go to solicit your vendors and say, will you do business with me on the same terms? But you need to know, and they need to know, that reaching out to a vendor under any circumstances during or after employment will subject them to damages and risk. That is very, very, very important. If they have relationships with vendors, then particularly if they have a relationship with someone who works at that vendor, there is nothing to stop them from getting two sets of invoices, a real one, and the one they want the vendor to bill you so they can get a kickback and the two can split the money, okay, which is a very nefarious way to take money from everyone. So watch out for that as well. Now, in terms of background checks, I've blogged about the background check issue. You should not be performing your own background checks. There are federal laws to protect confidential information. There are issues in employment law as to whether you can use such things as an arrest or the fact that someone has lost employment previously as the basis for an adverse employment decision. So that you have to be careful about. I generally recommend that you use a third-party vendor to do this so that you are insulated from any liability as a company. But nevertheless, you should perform background checks. I was asked by a nonprofit yesterday for an opinion on an issue, and the issue was that they hired an executive director. They interviewed her, and they thought they had done a background check because they called her prior employer and said, what do you think of her? That is not a background check. A background check takes the Social Security number, date of birth, and other information, and it literally checks for everything. It will look, even if your state law only allows, let's say, a conviction of a crime to go back 5 years or 10 years for the purpose of determining whether you should employ the person, it will tell you everything about them. And that is fundamentally important. You may not be able to refuse someone employment based on that, but trust me, you can always find bases for refusing employment to one person and finding another candidate to be preferential, but in a legal way. But this is something that raises red flags. If you are dealing with a financial services employee and you discover that they've declared bankruptcy, you discover that their creditors are suing them, red flags should be waving in the air, because that individual now has the potential motivation, even though you think they're such a good person and they'll never steal. You know, when they're facing eviction, they may. And these are things, frankly, that you have to consider as the employer. As I said, critical factors in whether what makes someone steal: motivation, rationalization, and opportunity. Now, you can't control the first two. You can mitigate in terms of employee selection, employee training, oversight, ongoing reviews, your internal system. But motivation and rationalization are very personalized to the employee. However, opportunity is created by the employer. And in that regard, you need to exercise control. Recognize what opportunities there are and mitigate against them. Motivation. In this economy, we see personal financial distress as being one of the leading factors which results in theft and embezzlement by workers, that the economy just overwhelmed them. The spouse lost his job, they had expenses they couldn't cover, and then there were certainly issues, the addictive behaviors, substance gambling, overspending. In some of your fields, in some states, individuals are required to have drug testing. And that's not just for the purposes of licensure, but the ability to randomly test your workers. And if you have the ability, you should exercise that ability. That is critical, because if a worker thinks that he's going to be tested for substance abuse and that you have discharged individuals because they have failed the drug test, and that you're scrupulous about how you administer the test and carry through with the chain of custody, you've taken away an option from them. And there are ways to beat substance abuse tests. I'm an expert on chain of custody cases. It's very hard to prove. It literally becomes a criminal trial with a civil trial in the cases that I used to judge. But they need to know that there's zero tolerance for substance abuse. The other thing, of course, is the recession. Whenever there is a recession or a downturn in the economy, you see the number of bank robberies going up, which is certainly a risky behavior, I would say. 3 banks in my neighborhood have been robbed in the last week. What we also see is that internal theft occurring, the embezzlement. Embezzlers try to rationalize their fraud. It's absolutely fascinating to hear them justify away what they have done. Sometimes it's their way of getting back at you. They're not happy with their pay. They think that they weren't paid fairly. Someone else is making more, so I'll even it out by literally stealing from the employer. Some people will say, I wasn't stealing, I was only borrowing it, and I intended to pay it back sometime in the future. Well, on what terms and how? I don't know, but I intended to give it back, so therefore in my mind I'm not a thief. And finally, some believe the company doesn't need the money. My employer is doing well enough, and my employer isn't smart enough. I'm smarter than the boss, although he makes the profit. So if I take this, he won't even miss it. He won't know it's missing, and who's being harmed, therefore? He's still drawing out, $1 million a year in income. I will tell you that my feeling about rationalization behaviors is that they cannot be tolerated whatsoever. Some of you may know that if you bond your employees, if you have insurance to cover them, that if you keep on an employee because they've quote-unquote borrowed, that you've voided your bonding insurance. And so it's bad enough that they may have borrowed a little from you, but think about what happens when you send someone into the field, into a client's home, and they decide to borrow from the client, but of course allegedly intend to return those items, like the jewelry and the cash and the valuables, at a future date. That's called theft. It's a felony. So you do not want to facilitate that kind of borrowing. If you condone any kind of quote-unquote borrowing, and then later that employee goes and steals from a third person, you are so liable, and your insurance company may find a way out of paying that claim because you did not discipline and discharge the individual. I'll tell you a personal story about rationalization. My husband is a doctor, and he always kept around $100 in small bills at the front desk so that his girl could make change for co-payments. And one night, he realized he didn't have any single dollars in his wallet, and he wanted to pay what he calls his co-pay, which is to give a tip to the guy in the garage. And he opened the envelope, and the envelope was completely empty. So of course he became very upset because he thought that the maybe a patient had walked behind the desk and taken it. He didn't know who took it, how. And the next day he said to someone who had worked for him for quite a few years, the envelope is empty. And she got a funny smile on her face, and she said, yeah, I know. I needed the money, and I took it, but I was going to give it back to you. And he said, if you had come to me and said, I need money, I would certainly have not lent it. And I always tell employers, make sure your manual makes it clear that you do not lend money. It's a very bad practice. He said, I would have given it to you. if you needed it to pay bills or buy groceries for your child. But you took from me, and I feel violated by that. And needless to say, he wrote her a final paycheck that day. And that was somebody who was a very good medical assistant for a long, long time. You know, you can't accept rationalization, because if someone rationalizes and they're rationalizing taking $50, believe me, next month it'll be $100, and the month after that it'll be $500. Embezzlement follows patterns, which I'll get into in a little while, and you must be aware that in general, embezzlement doesn't start with an enormous amount of theft. It doesn't start with $10,000. It'll start with $10. So the time to nip it in the bud is when it begins, not down the road. Now, opportunity. Ask yourself, do my workers have access to my assets? Do they have access to passwords? How many of you have computer systems where everybody knows the boss's password? Or you have one password fits all? You're not supposed to do that under HIPAA if any of you deal in security systems that provide monitoring services. But people do it all the time. Don't do it. Don't make funds available. Restrict access to funds. Control spending. If someone has an ATM card, if you have a salesperson and you feel you have to give them the ATM card because what if they have a gasoline expense? Cap it. Always cap advances that you give to salespeople. If they hit that maximum cap, they may not get more. Evaluate their spending, one, against all the other employees who have access to have such an account. Is something aberrant? It doesn't hurt to know, by the way, what kind of car they're driving if you're reimbursing for gasoline. Because, you know, if someone's driving a Prius and their bills are as high as someone who's driving a Tahoe, something's going on that you haven't figured out. So also, it's very important that you dictate the way in which spending is recorded. Again, if somebody has a drawing account, are you making sure that they must hand in original invoices? Do you take Xerox copies? Who's controlling? Who's watching the ship? It's important also to recognize that employees who defalcate, there are two different kinds. Some are lone rangers. They operate on their own, very secretly. But sometimes what you find in the workplace is that there's collaborative embezzlement. You know, one needs the other for the scheme to work, front office and back office, for example. And so they join up, and neither one's going to rat the other out because then they're both going to jail. When employees think that you trust them, and especially if they know that your controls are weak, you are a setup for embezzlement. So it's really important that you're not an accusatory employer per se, but that you question bills. I can't read this. Could you bring me a clearer invoice? How is it that you spent so much money on gas last week? What was your tachometer reading starting and ending the week? Does it match? There's nothing wrong with you asking these questions. And in fact, when a worker knows that you're asking the questions, and I'll tell you, some of you who are my clients, you ask me questions. How'd you bill 5 hours on that last week? I didn't think it would take you 5 hours. Can you explain it? Do the same internally, not just to somebody who hands you a bill. It's a very, very good tool to use, because if employees know that you're watching, okay, then they're a little bit more intimidated. Maybe they'll go somewhere else and steal from someone else, but they're less likely to steal from you. Now, I want to talk to you about auditing for a second. Audits are very interesting. I wonder how many of you know that when your CPA certifies your books, that all he's saying, and I apologize for a misspelling over here, it looks like Italian, all they're saying is that based upon the books and the records have been given, there's no material misstatement in the financial statements that we produce as a consequence. So auditors are not necessarily responsible for detecting fraud. You can, with major accounting firms, request a specific fraud audit. Now, a fraud audit is retrospective. You'll see fraud audits in nonprofit entities frequently because the state may question, why is your expense ratio so high in relation to the dollars you're taking. And they publish that information in New York. And if the Attorney General gets involved, he'll say, you know what, I'd like you to have a fraud audit because 80 cents out of every dollar as a charity is going to your administrative expenses. I don't understand this. But an audit, which is retrospective, is not the same as a financial control system. When you have a financial control system, you are attempting to reduce the risk of fraud going forward. An audit is looking backwards to pick up fraud. Well, isn't that too late? Look at the amounts of money that were embezzled in the examples that I gave you, just the first few examples. I think we've got $2 million of fraud. So that's a very, very important thing to do. Now, how do you assess risk for fraud? And I frequently do this for clients. I can tell them, I see an exposure point here. I have a problem with this. Let's deal with it either by the manual or in some other way to try to protect you. So a fraud risk assessment identifies where fraud might occur in an organization and how it might be perpetrated. So you look at the risks and the scenarios. For example, how money handling, front and back office interface. You look at the steps in locking in a receivable from a client. Who does it? Is more than one person involved? And then you basically work with people individually to try to figure out what their risks are and what controls can be put in place. Now, each of you can look at your system, frankly. You know your systems better than anyone. And say, okay, if I was a thief and I looked at this piece of the process, what could I do? How would I try to steal? And all I can tell you is having been the judge in so many cases with people who did steal in front of me, I have a very good sense of the workings of the criminal mind. And some of the examples of fraud are, and I'll tell you a couple that I've seen as a judge, are just absolutely staggering in the volume of money that was involved and in the, let me use the New York word, chutzpah, the nerve of the person committing the fraud. So it's important for you to think through those scenarios on a hypothetical basis. Also, remember that risks change, and they are guaranteed to change. The minute you put up a roadblock in one area, what does the driver do? He tries to find a detour. So whenever you do create a stopgap, you always must think, now that I've done that, can they get around stopgap in a slightly different way? So to create a compliance program, it's very important that programs be customized to the organization. Step one in compliance goes way before thinking about fraud, frankly. Step one is, do you have an employee manual that tells the employees, this is my standard. This is what I mandate from you. If you do less, if you attempt to do something that's improper, you're going to be warned at a minimum if I have any suspicions. And if I think that you actually have done something, you're not going to have a job tomorrow. So weigh the odds. What's more important to you, stealing $50 or having a job tomorrow? I got a call on Sunday morning from a client. Some of you who are my clients know I give out my cell phone number because employment law is putting out fires. And sometimes those fires happen on Saturdays and Sundays, and the employer is crazed, but he wants to have a plan in his head to face his workers on Monday morning. So I got a call from someone who's a physician, and he said, I was in my office on Saturday, and my cleaning lady came in before the end of my office hours, and my 3 staffers were there, and he doesn't trust his staffers. And honestly, it's because he didn't have a good manual, and the staffers pulled a fast one on him 6 months ago, and where he should have fired one of them, he was afraid. They smell blood. They know he's scared of them. Okay? They've pulled the race card on him, and they've pulled the sexual harassment card on him completely inappropriately. But they've done it, and so now he's running scared. Never, ever show that you are scared to an employee, ever. It's the kiss of death. So his cleaning lady came in, hung her pocketbook on a door, and he has a surveillance video. He thinks he's going to be really smart. Surveillance videos are wonderful, but when doctors tell me they spend their weekends watching their surveillance videos as opposed to maybe reading a medical journal or enjoying their time with the family, I get nervous. It makes me wonder, are they good managers? Do they need to be listening to me or reaching out and discussing how to be an employer as opposed to trying to watch the employees after the fact and lay blame? So he watches this video, and what he sees is this one woman who's his troublemaker walk toward the pocketbook, but then the video cuts off, which is, of course, the limitation of video that's not 360. Then he sees her walk back, and she stuffs something in her pocket, and then he sees her go into what appears to be her own wallet 3 times. So he concludes that she's the thief. Well, that's not enough for the New York City Police Department, let me tell you. It also doesn't establish a clear chain of custody of anything that might be there. And he says to me, well, what am I supposed to do about this? And that's where you've got a problem. He doesn't have a manual. He has never said, you know, if this occurs or that occurs, I will not tolerate it. And now basically you've got 4 people, and the 3 people who work for him are going to say that the cleaning lady is lying. So step 1 is speak to your cleaning lady a couple of days later and make sure that she didn't misplace the money. I misplace my car keys every other day. So make sure she didn't have it in her pocket and thought that it was in her pocketbook. Just be safe about that before you make any accusations. The second thing is to call in your staff and say, my cleaning lady, Esmeralda, is missing $60. Has anybody found $60? Is there anything anyone wants to tell me in private? Okay? And now he's in a real bind because they're all saying, we know nothing. And ironically, he would like to fire these people. He's not happy with them. And I told him he could go ahead and fire all 3 of them together, but do not fire the one you believe went into her pocket. She could have gone into her pocket for a tissue. And if you try to go after her, she will pull a discrimination card on you. But if you fire all 3 of them at once, then you can say, since no one's fessing up, I cannot run a practice where I am not comfortable wondering who was the thief. All right, so I can protect my organization by cleaning house and then, frankly, putting a new manual in place and taking control of your organization before you bring new people in. I know that's a difficult and it's a very painful thing to do in a business, and sometimes it's the only thing you can do to cut off the potential for significant fraud going forward. Education and training is imperative. Everybody involved in the organization should know what the standards are, and if you have to train them on reporting the notion that if you whistleblow on a coworker who has stolen, that your job is protected, your confidentiality will be protected to the extent possible, and it's important to say to the extent possible because we know that if you don't protect confidentiality completely, because sometimes that just cannot be, as a matter of fact, you're going to need to be exposed. And then there must be meaningful discipline. Those of you who have my anti-discrimination, anti-retaliation policy know, in terms of investigation, that individuals can report as whistleblowers not only to the employer, but they can report directly to me. And I do that for a good reason. Some people are afraid to go to the employer. They're afraid someone's listening at the door. They're afraid that there could be consequences, you know, that someone will figure out that they were the one who reported. And it's a lot easier for them to dial me in Garden City, New York, and say, hi, Judge, I work for so-and-so, and I'm very nervous, but I have to get this off my chest. And then I can deal with the employer and institute the investigation that needs to be taken. If you believe that a crime occurs, you must notify the police. That's to prevent your exposure and to charge later that you failed to take the proper action. If the police decline to pursue, that's their decision, but you should never think that you shouldn't bring them in. I'll tell you another case from my husband's office. My husband does not have security cameras in his office, and the reason is he's a surgeon. And in all his rooms, women get undressed every single day because he does a lot of breast surgery and tummy tucks. And so the way drugs are ordered in his practice is that he has an order with the drug company, Henry Schein, which is a big supplier in New York, that no one's allowed to order a controlled substance except for him. And he has a very unique handwriting. It is virtually unforgeable. When the gauze and all the other supplies, syringes, show up every Friday, one girl is assigned to go into the operating room and unpack. And what she did, unbeknownst to him, was that she ordered some substances that are painkillers. Painkillers are very cheap when a doctor buys them. They're very expensive when you sell them on the street corner. And she basically, on the recommendation of a boyfriend, ordered 4 bottles. The 4 bottles had a street value of around $15,000. They actually cost around $25 to the doctor. And it happened that that I opened up the bill in his office and saw these drugs and thought that's a lot of medication given the amount of surgery he did. And I said, did you order this? And he said, absolutely not. We called the company. They said, of course, it was a phone order. Well, what date? Doctor wasn't in the office on that day. How could it have been ordered? Well, it wasn't ordered by the doctor. It was one of the girls, but we don't know which one. Again, that's poor, processing on their part. And what occurred was that she had gone into the room without the camera, which is the main OR, put it in her pocket, and when she came out, her pockets were actually bulging. And then she left and went out onto the street, and she transferred them to the boyfriend. The building had a security camera, and the building's camera shows the handoff. But we didn't have the camera inside to show that she had actually taken the drug, so there was no chain of custody. I will tell you that the police actually went up to the grand jury level on that one. They wanted to send a message to the street, and she was not indicted. But I know that it scared the hell out of her, and frankly, her mother had worked for my husband, and her mother resigned in shame. You do need to go to the police. Now, what's a good step in compliance? One girl is not allowed to open any box whatsoever in that office. 2 of them have to open it and complete a log sheet, and they both have to initial it. So if one was the thief and the other one was not her accomplice, it cannot happen. Also, we reported Henry Schein, the company, to the Drug Enforcement Administration and to New York State. They weren't happy about it, but that was too bad because they sold drugs against a standing order that the doctor only could place the order, and he's the only man in that office. So again, you can backtrack on it and say, what can I do to guard against this going forward? I think that he actually wound up closing down part of his drug account with them as a consequence. So these are things that you should evaluate whenever a breach does take place. I will also talk about business ethics. I'm on the board of the Center for Ethics in Business at Loyola Marymount in LA, and I judge the International Intercollegiate Business Ethics Competition every year. When management sets a tone for ethical behavior and fair business practices and also fair employment practices, that will permeate through your entire organization. So if you are doing things that are sleazy, and I'm sure you're not because you're clients of our firm, but for management that acts inappropriately can expect that its workers will also do the same back. They think, okay, well, if they do it to their clients, I can do it to them. So it's important that you do set a proper tone. Let me talk about control measures, because now I'm going to get very, very specific here. So what are some classic control mechanisms? One is double signatures on checks and cash disbursements, multiple layers of approval for purchases, written approval for the use of a credit card beyond a set amount. A client wrote to me yesterday, I'm finalizing documents, and said, we're hiring 2 new workers. They're going to be in the field. We want to give them credit cards. And I wrote back and said, have you set a daily limit on what they can charge on the credit card? Have you set a weekly limit on the credit card? Have you dealt with a credit card company, American Express is notorious for this, which is more likely to call you on the day of a potential misuse of the card than for you to find out later when you get a bill? Do you review every credit card statement and every expense account report? I recommend that strongly. Don't just look at the number and say, okay, well, it was $500 last month, $500 this month, and other people charge $600. It's fine. Read every single one of those charges to make sure that there's nothing in there like KB Toys or Toys R Us, assuming that that has nothing to do with your business model. You know, don't. And if an employee says to you, well, you know, I went into KB Toys to buy my kid his birthday present. I totally forgot. I had no money in my wallet. I used your credit card. Again, a red flag goes up. Then you take the card away. Okay, that would be a first step. If you didn't think that he was cheating you must have an action and a reaction. Take the card away. Well, then you don't have the right to have the credit card, or you don't have the right to have the draw as a salesperson. I'm not comfortable. Submit afterwards. Anytime someone hands you a check, it needs to have the invoice. So unfortunately, the Internet makes this difficult for us because without the Internet, you want to say, I want the original signed invoice. I hate to tell you this, and this is something I saw all the time as a judge. You can take a document, you can scan it into the computer, and you can do all sorts of creative things with it to change the numbers. It does not hurt to call up that invoicing company, your supplier, on a routine basis, just randomly. I just want to confirm the amount this month. Was that $882? It's a little faint. I'm not sure if it's $882 or $832. They might tell you it was really $632 and your employee changed it. Are you going to catch everything this way? No, but you may catch something. And then people need to know that, by the way, guess what? If they're in cahoots, guess what? The employer called up to verify that. Okay? Is he suspicious? Maybe, maybe not, but you're sending a signal. But as I said, try to pay only from original invoices. Never pre-sign checks. Kiss of death. Very dangerous to pre-sign checks. Never use a signature stamp. I hate signature stamps because I've seen in many instances where someone got their hands on the signature stamp, made a duplicate of the signature stamp, and went to town. Frankly, if you have them, or if you have blank checks in your office, they should be under lock and key at all times. Again, when I told you about signing a check and writing Abraham Lincoln on it, you know, if it's a blank check and if it disappears from your checkbook, don't assume that it was your mistake and you calculated on the numbers. Always assume that somebody could have taken that check and signed your name or forged your name, or frankly not even tried to write your name. When I told you that law school story, we used to do things like signing checks, Lucy Ricardo. One year somebody wrote Alexa Hente on my check. Oh, and by the way, I had them sign it, so it wasn't my handwriting. And I have a lousy handwriting, but clearly I have a distinct style. I'm a lefty. I had people signing in completely different kinds of script than I write. And guess what? The bank cashed it anyway. So watch out for that. I strongly recommend that you segregate duties, meaning that one individual shouldn't be responsible for an entire financial transaction. For example, the same person should not be receiving, depositing, recording, and reconciling receipts, and the same person should not be authorizing payments, dispersing funds, and reconciling bank statements. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. We're really small businesses. We employ 15 people, and most of those people are the people who are going out into the fields and doing installations. The only one person who can do these things is you as the owner, because you're not going to steal from yourself. If you are not doing this yourself, unless you have a very bad marriage, this is where you see wives working in the business, because nobody will guard your money except against the clothing store or the jewelry store better than your own wife. Okay, so I want to mention that to you. It's important also, and here's one of my great horror stories, people who hold financial positions, make them take their vacations. Okay? Do not get caught in the trap of believing that the individual is so indispensable to your organization that you can't let them go, and you'd be happy paying them rather than letting them take vacation. An employee who won't go on vacation is an employee who is likely to be committing a fraud or embezzling. Best example of this happened in a school district on Long Island, Roslyn, New York. The head of the Board of Education, the superintendent, was beloved. The man never went on vacation. He He did things for parents who were heads of the PTA that were just unbelievably gracious and generous. And he never, ever went away. You know why? Because he managed to embezzle $8 million from the school district over a relatively short period of time. The controller was his accomplice. And when someone who has a financial position doesn't go on vacation, it's because they don't want you to open the mail in their absence and discover the things that they have done to produce income for themselves. They don't want you to discover the real invoice if they're actually expecting you to pay a couple $100 more with a difference in their pockets. In the medical field, if they make false bills and they intend to take that check from the insurance company and force it to themselves, well, the last thing they need you to do is open up the remittances and take the checks to the bank, or to say, that's really weird. I didn't treat that patient on that particular day. How could there be a bill? The insurance must have made a mistake. They will refuse to go on vacation. Biggest red flag that I can tell you about. I highly recommend that you conduct background checks. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I've just gone too far. I recommend that you conduct background checks. 7% of all embezzlers have prior criminal convictions. You will see prior instances of fraud, and you will also see undisclosed criminal records. I know that, for example, in the state of Florida, that installers' backgrounds are checked for 5 years, going backwards as to whether they've been convicted of a crime. If you conduct a background check apart from the state-mandated check, you can actually check for a lot more information. And let me add one other thing. I know it's very difficult in many industries, but do not hire somebody provisionally subject to the outcome of the background check. Wait for the check. If you hire them and then you fire them based on information in the background check, believe it or not, they may be unemployment eligible and your account will be charged, and that will cost you a heck of a lot of money going forward for the next 3 years. Also remember that an arrest or an unrelated conviction cannot form the basis for an employment decision in and of itself, which means that if you do have somebody who's been arrested or convicted of something not relevant to the issue before us, as the employer, you must document in your records a very good reason why you did not hire them. I find that this week I've been doing a lot of work and research for a client in the home care industry. New York has just started enforcing a law. It's actually 3 years old, saying that if you have workers in your home, that you're going to have to pay them on W-2s, keep hourly records just like you do in your business. The law is very egregious. California passed the identical law last week, and bad news for all of you who have part-time maids or who have housekeepers or who have someone taking care of your elderly parents is that the Department of Labor has announced that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, this will happen throughout the United States, which is supposed to bring in more tax revenues for employment tax and withholding taxes effective January 1 of 2015. Don't ask me why they can't delay Obamacare, and they're delaying this. It's so that the employment agencies can get their acts together in the meantime. I mention this to you because one of the worst cases I ever tried as a judge involved a family who had money stolen from them by the father's home care aide. And he signed his own check, but he wasn't of really good capacity anymore. And in a year, he signed $250,000 of checks. He paid for her cruise on Carnival Cruise Lines, also for her son and a friend. He paid for clothing. He paid her health insurance. He paid her child's tuition. He paid her on a weekly basis a ridiculous amount of money, probably around $2,500 a week of salary, way in excess of what the market could bear and also in excess of his personal means. His children did not catch that, by the way, until he had a heart attack and was in the hospital. And when they came and arranged for him to go into a nursing home and they went through the checkbooks, something was very mysterious. The balance had gone down $250,000 in a year. The PS was that the Nassau County attorney wanted to indict this woman. They couldn't because his name and his signature was on every single check, and because when they interviewed him, he no longer, after this heart attack and its effect on him, he no longer had the capacity to remember exactly, and he could not be a witness. Amazingly, when they checked her records, they found out that she had been convicted of doing exactly the same thing to a little old man in Forest Hills, which is around 10 miles away, the year before. So for any kind of work or a background check can be absolutely invaluable. If you have contracts, you want to make sure that the person who's sending it out for contract quotes is not getting a kickback. So the contract should need the approval of the manager who's not involved in the transaction. You have outside salespeople who are involved in something for you. That's why it's a great thing when the home office has to approve the contract. Anything that's a large purchase must require owner approval. Do not trust your employees to engage in business on your behalf. That's why you're the boss. The boss has the risk of profit, the risk of loss, and you also have the potential for profit. Don't give away your risk of profit, your potential profit by exposing yourself to tremendous risk of loss. The environment of your workplace should encourage whistleblowing. People will not report theft if they believe their jobs will be in jeopardy. You should contact your lawyer immediately if someone makes an allegation that something is happening in the workplace. These are complicated issues. There are a lot of legal rules that are applicable that you will not know, and you do not want to mess up an investigation, both in terms of evidence and potential exposure in the event that that turns out not to be a fraud. Provide alternate means of access. Some people are scared to death of the boss. They would rather tell a supervisor. If you make the supervisors only the people who the whistleblower can go to, if the whistleblower is trying to whistleblow on their own supervisor, they will feel that they have no way of getting, especially in a larger entity. I do have clients in your business, in the security business, who are multi-state. They don't know the boss. All they know is his picture is on a website. So it's important for you to establish some methodology. For some people, I recommend that you select one person who's male and one person who's female as the internal reports. Some women will be very intimidated to go to a man and vice versa, and it's a good idea. I recommend that you have computerized notification. If you tell your bank, your banking company, that if there's unusual account activity or there's a balance threshold that's reached, you must notify us. That can be done. Your accountant will know how to put fraud filters on your accounts also to pick something up. Dealing with fraud is a multifaceted thing. It requires not just your lawyer, but sometimes consultants, and definitely the involvement of your accountant. So use every resource you have to prevent fraud. I hope that this has been useful to you. I apologize that I did not tell you during the webinar that if you have questions, you should please feel free to write them. Someone did write, was the slide skipped? And you were absolutely right. Yes, it was skipped, but I covered all of the information. The PowerPoints will be put on the internet. They should be available along with an audio tape of today's presentation, and that will be available within the next few days. Sometimes the system doesn't work as well as we'd like, and it takes a little bit longer, but I think you can expect that to happen going forward. If there are any subjects you would like me to cover in ongoing webinars, please write to me. My email address is rkraft@kirschenbaums.com. If you are not on my listserv to receive my employment law blog on a weekly basis, please go to the employment law section of the website and sign up for the blog. A new blog post is going out today. I write them every single week. And there is a compendium of my writing on employment law that is available to you at all times on the website. So in the absence of any further questions, I'll give you a couple more minutes in case somebody wants to write. Okay, no questions. That means that the record is closed, as we say in court, and I want to wish you all a very, very good afternoon. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or you have any needs in the areas of employment law. I cover the entire gamut of employment law, from employee manuals, disciplinary warnings, business strategy, the Affordable Care Act issues that are coming up now, employee benefits, and I can go on forever because employment law is the largest area of growth in the legal arena these days. Lots of new case law and lots of changes. Have a great day, everybody.